10 Darkest Sides of Europe. Europe is often celebrated as a beacon of freedom, progress, and equality, a continent rich in history, innovation, and cultural diversity. However, beneath the surface of its picturesque cities and vibrant societies lies a much darker reality. Today, we are peeling back the layers to confront 10 of Europe's gravest challenges, issues that many prefer to ignore, but which demand urgent attention. From human trafficking to the wealth gap, these interconnected crises shine a light on exploitation, inequality, and systemic failure. Let us explore these critical issues one by one to understand the deeper struggles of Europe. Human trafficking is often referred to as modern-day slavery, and Europe is far from immune to this harrowing crime. Across the continent, human trafficking thrives in the shadows of everyday life. Vulnerable individuals, particularly women and children, are coerced or kidnapped into forced labor, sexual exploitation, or domestic servitude. This billion-dollar illegal industry thrives due to complex international networks and the failure of authorities to prevent or punish those responsible. Victims often come from poorer regions, lured by false promises of work or safety. Upon arrival, they are stripped of their rights, identities, and dignity. Devastatingly, this industry continues to grow, capitalizing on weaknesses in legal enforcement and victim protection. Combating human trafficking requires a coordinated international effort. Governments must step up enforcement, protect survivors, and address the socio-economic vulnerabilities that fuel this hidden slave trade. Organized crime across Europe is expanding in both scope and sophistication. These networks are involved in almost every lucrative illegal market imaginable, from drug smuggling and arms dealing to human smuggling and cybercrime. One of the most troubling aspects of organized crime is how deeply it infiltrates communities. In addition to sowing fear and violence, these networks often manipulate local economies and government institutions, undermining governance and public trust. Victims are not just those directly affected by crime, but the wider population who suffer from a weakened rule of law. The rise of technology has made these criminals harder to trace, with new tools such as encrypted communication aiding their illicit activities. A stronger collective effort, combining intelligence, regulation, and grassroots community engagement, is critical to address this growing threat. Homelessness is a growing crisis throughout Europe, with cities and towns struggling to care for their most vulnerable residents. Rising property prices, stagnant wages, and a fractured safety net have contributed to a drastic increase in homelessness across the continent. Homelessness is not just a housing issue, it is a symptom of broader societal failures, where economic inequality, mental health struggles, and substance abuse amplify the problem. Those affected often include not only adults, but also families and children, who lack the stability and dignity of a safe home. The visuals of tent cities and people living on the streets starkly contrast with Europe's image of prosperity. More resources and systemic reforms are needed to provide housing, job support, and treatment options for those caught in the downward spiral. Far-right extremism, characterized by hate-filled rhetoric and divisive ideologies, is on the rise across Europe. These movements have been fueled by a combination of economic anxieties, cultural tensions, and the rapid spread of misinformation online. This revival of xenophobia and nationalism often targets immigrants, refugees, and ethnic minorities, leading to a sharp increase in hate crimes. Such crimes range from verbal harassment to acts of brutal violence, tearing apart societal trust and inclusivity. What's particularly alarming is how some political figures have repeated far-right talking points, legitimizing these dangerous ideologies. Combating far-right extremism requires effective policies, greater accountability for hate crimes, and investment in community-based initiatives that promote inclusion and education. Europe is currently grappling with a silent epidemic: drug addiction. Across urban centers and rural areas alike, drug dependency is destroying lives and families. What's especially alarming is the increasing prevalence of synthetic drugs, which carry devastating health consequences. Addiction is more than personal. It poses a public health crisis. Treatment facilities across Europe are often underfunded and inaccessible, leaving people unable to receive the help they desperately need. Additionally, stigma around addiction prevents open dialogue, leaving many to suffer in isolation. Countries need to prioritize addiction prevention programs alongside accessible rehab options. Addressing drug addiction requires treating it not as a moral failing, but as the complex health issue it truly is. The trust that citizens place in their leaders is often betrayed by corruption and political scandals. From embezzlement to bribery, corruption has plagued political systems across Europe, eroding democratic principles and creating public disillusionment. When leaders prioritize personal gain over the public's welfare, the consequences ripple across society. Scandals not only undermine trust in government institutions, but also create barriers to effective policymaking, leaving citizens feeling helpless and unheard. Transparency, accountability, and independent oversight are key to restoring public trust. Without them, the cycle of distrust and discontent will continue to grow. As Europe's population grows, so does overcrowding, with many low-income individuals and families forced to live in cramped, unsafe conditions. This issue is compounded in major cities, where housing demand outpaces supply, driving up costs and worsening inequality. Exploitation is also rampant in these conditions. Unscrupulous landlords often take advantage of tenants, charging exorbitant rents for substandard housing. In some cases, immigrants and refugees become easy targets, lacking the social protections and legal recourse to challenge such exploitation. This glaring disparity calls for governments to prioritize affordable housing projects, enforce stricter housing regulations, and protect vulnerable populations from abuse. A dignified home is not a luxury. It is a basic human right. Illegal immigration is a contentious issue in Europe, but what often gets lost in the debate is the human cost. Desperate individuals fleeing war, violence, and poverty often face a horrifying reality upon arrival: exploitation. Many refugees end up working dangerously low-paying jobs under exploitative employers, with no legal protections or rights. Others are trafficked into criminal networks, where they experience unimaginable abuse. Europe's failure to create cohesive, dignified solutions for refugees is part of this problem. Instead of policies rooted in humanity, the focus remains on restrictive measures that perpetuate suffering. A balance must be struck between securing borders and offering sanctuary to those in need. The wealth gap in Europe is growing at an alarming rate, creating a stark contrast between the richest elite and the poorest communities. This disparity is perhaps most visible in urban areas, where luxury and affluence share space with poverty and deprivation. Economic inequality isn't just about numbers. It translates to unequal opportunities for education, healthcare, and a better quality of life. This growing chasm fuels resentment, social unrest, and a deepening sense of division within societies. Governments must address the systemic factors behind this inequality: unfair tax systems, wage stagnation, and inadequate social welfare policies. Closing the wealth gap is essential to building an equitable, stable society. The issues facing Europe, human trafficking, organized crime, rising homelessness, and more, are all interconnected. At their core, they are symptoms of systemic exploitation, where the vulnerable are treated as commodities or marginalized altogether. Addressing these challenges will require collective action on every level: individuals, communities, governments, and international alliances. Although these realities paint a grim picture, change is possible. Europe has a history of resilience and reform. By prioritizing equity, compassion, and justice, the continent can move toward a future where these struggles are no longer ignored, but actively resolved. Let this video serve not only as a reflection on Europe's darkest issues, but as a call to action. Each of us has a role to play in shaping a fairer, more inclusive Europe. Together, we can inspire progress and brighter days ahead.